The blood-red horizon swallowed the setting sun as Benjamin Tucker's axe split another log, his muscles screaming in protest against the day's unending labor. Sweat dripped from his brow despite the cooling autumn air, but he couldn't stop, not with winter approaching and the homestead still half prepared. When the pain shot through his lower back like a bolt of lightning, the axe slipped from his calloused hands and thudded against the hard Wyoming dirt. It was 1878, and Ben had spent 3 years transforming this plot of wild frontier land into something resembling a proper ranch. His 28 years had been lived hard, first as a Union soldier despite his youth, then as a drifter, and finally as a desperate homesteader grabbing at America's promise of land and possibility. The war had taught him discipline. The years after had taught him solitude. What he hadn't learned was when to rest. Katherine Ellis had been watching from the porch of the small cabin, her honey-brown hair catching the last rays of sunlight. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied the hardships she'd endured. When Ben collapsed, clutching his back, she rushed across the yard, her skirts gathered in her hands. "Benjamin Tucker, you stubborn fool," she chided, though her voice was gentle as she helped him to his feet. "You've been at it since dawn." "There's still daylight left," Ben groaned through gritted teeth. "The barn roof needs patching before rest," Katherine interrupted firmly. "The chores will wait." Her words, simple yet profound, hung in the air between them. Ben had never been good at waiting, at resting, at admitting the limitations of his own body. But something in Katherine's steady gaze made him nod in reluctant agreement. Katherine had arrived at Ben's homestead 6 months earlier, answering his advertisement for a housekeeper. Her husband had died 2 years prior, leaving her with nothing but debts and memories in Missouri. Ben's offer of room, board, and modest wages had been her salvation, a chance to start anew in Wyoming territory where the past couldn't follow so easily. What neither had anticipated was the slow, cautious dance they'd begun around each other. Two wounded souls, careful not to step too close, yet increasingly aware of the other's presence. Now, with Ben's arm draped over her shoulders as she guided him toward the cabin, Katherine felt the warmth of him against her side, the solid reality of another human being after so many months of careful distance. "I can manage," Ben protested weakly as they reached the porch steps. "I'm sure you can," Katherine replied, not loosening her grip, "but you don't have to." Inside the cabin, the main room was bathed in the golden glow of oil lamps. Katherine had made the sparse furnishings as comfortable as possible during her months, their cushions on the wooden chairs, bright quilts folded neatly, wildflowers in a mason jar on the table. The scent of rabbit stew wafted from the cast iron pot hanging over the fire. Ben lowered himself gingerly onto the bed in the corner, wincing as his back protested. "Thank you," he muttered, embarrassment coloring his words. He hated appearing weak, especially in front of Katherine. "Lie on your stomach," she instructed, already moving to the shelf where she kept her medicines and tinctures. "I'll make a poultice for your back." Ben obeyed reluctantly, turning to watch as Katherine mixed herbs in a small bowl. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, grinding dried arnica and comfrey with a mortar and pestle before adding a splash of witch hazel. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, genuinely curious. In their months together, they had spoken little of their pasts. Katherine's hands stilled momentarily. "My grandmother was what some might call a hedge witch, just a woman who knew plants and their properties." She resumed her work. "She taught me before she passed." "My ma knew some of that," Ben offered, surprising himself. He rarely spoke of his family. "Before the fever took her," Katherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. Loss was a language they both spoke fluently. She approached the bed with the poultice and a length of clean cloth. "You'll need to remove your shirt." Ben hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned his work shirt, revealing a torso marked by scars, some from the war, others from the unforgiving life of the frontier. Katherine's expression remained neutral, though her eyes softened at the map of hardship written on his skin. Her fingers were cool against his inflamed muscles as she spread the poultice across his lower back. Ben flinched at first, then gradually relaxed as the herbs began to ease the burning pain. You push yourself too hard, Katherine said softly as she worked. This land will still be here tomorrow. Winter won't wait, Ben replied, his voice muffled against the pillow. And neither will the bank if I can't make this place turn a profit soon. Katherine secured the poultice with strips of cloth, her touch efficient yet gentle. Is the mortgage troubling you that badly? Ben sighed. 2 more years to prove up the homestead, and every penny I had went into seed and livestock, if the winter's harsh. He left the sentence unfinished. We'll manage, Katherine said with quiet certainty, and Ben felt something loosen in his chest at her use of we. She stood, smoothing her apron. Rest now, I'll bring you some stew. As she moved toward the fireplace, Ben called after her, Katherine. She turned, the firelight casting shadows across her face. Thank you for everything. A small smile touched her lips. That's what neighbors are for, Mr. Tucker. Ben, he corrected, meeting her gaze steadily. After all this time, I think you can call me Ben. Ben, she agreed, and something shifted between them, subtle as a change in the wind. That night, as Ben drifted in and out of sleep, his back still aching despite Katherine's ministrations, he found himself thinking of her words. The chores will wait. In his 3 years on the homestead, he'd never allowed himself that luxury. Every moment had been filled with work digging, building, planting, harvesting, a relentless march toward making the land viable. His dreams that night were fragmented, memories of his father working their small Tennessee farm until the day he dropped dead in the fields, of his mother's worn hands always busy with some task, of the war where rest meant death. He awoke before dawn, as was his habit, but found himself unable to rise, his back seized in protest. The sound of the cabin door opening made him turn his head. Katherine entered, carrying an armful of wood for the morning fire. She moved quietly, assuming he was still asleep, and Ben watched through half-closed eyes as she efficiently built up the fire and hung the coffee pot over the flames. There was a grace to her movements that he'd never fully appreciated before, a competence that spoke of years of similar mornings. Her hair was loosely braided, a few strands escaping to frame her face in the growing firelight. For a moment, Ben allowed himself to imagine a lifetime of such mornings, with Katherine moving about their shared space, the two of them building something more than just a homestead. The thought startled him and he shifted, giving away his wakefulness. Katherine turned immediately. You're awake early, she said, coming to check on him. How's the back? Stiff, Ben admitted reluctantly, but I need to get up. The cattle can wait another hour, Katherine interrupted firmly. The coffee isn't even ready yet. She reached out, touching his forehead with the back of her hand as if checking for fever. The casual intimacy of the gesture hung between them for a heartbeat too long before she withdrew, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. I'll check the cattle myself, she said, moving away to pour herself a cup of coffee. Ben frowned. You don't need to do that, it's not your responsibility. Katherine turned, an unexpected fire in her eyes. And who decided that, Benjamin Tucker? You hired me to keep your house, yes, but I'm not incapable of other work. I managed a farm with my husband for 10 years before he died. The revelation hung in the air between them. Katherine rarely spoke of her marriage, just as Ben rarely spoke of his time in the war. I didn't know, Ben said softly. Katherine's expression softened. There's a lot we don't know about each other, despite sharing 4 walls for half a year. She poured a second cup of coffee and brought it to him, helping him sit up against the pillows to drink it. Perhaps it's time we changed that. The coffee was hot and strong, exactly how Ben liked it. Perhaps it is, he agreed, watching her over the rim of his cup. That day marked a turning point. Ben's injury forced him to stay close to the cabin, directing Katherine in the essential chores while he occupied himself with mending harnesses and other tasks that could be done sitting down. To his surprise, Katherine proved remarkably capable with the livestock, approaching the cattle with a confident ease that spoke of long experience. My father raised beef cattle in Missouri, she explained when Ben commented on it that evening as they sat before the fire. I helped him from the time I could walk until I married at 18. And your husband, he was a cattleman too? Ben asked, genuinely interested in piecing together the puzzle of Katherine's past. A shadow crossed her face. No, James was a wheat farmer. He had grand ideas about becoming rich from the railroad demand. She stared into the flames. He borrowed heavily to expand year after year. When the drought came in 75, we lost everything. James couldn't bear it. She paused, swallowing hard. They called it apoplexy, but I think his heart simply broke under the weight of his failures. Ben reached across the space between their chairs, hesitantly taking her hand. I'm sorry, Katherine. She squeezed his fingers gratefully before withdrawing her hand. What about you? You never speak of your life before Wyoming. Ben shifted uncomfortably, the familiar walls threatening to rise again. But something in Katherine's open gaze made him want to try to offer her a piece of himself in exchange for what she had shared. I was born in eastern Tennessee. My father had a small farm there, barely enough to feed us most years. When the war came, our county voted to stay with the Union while the rest of the state seceded. His voice grew distant with memory. I was just 15, but I lied about my age and joined up with the 1st Tennessee Cavalry. Thought I was being a hero. Katherine watched him silently, allowing him to continue at his own pace. 3 years of fighting. Saw things no boy should see. Ben's jaw tightened. Came home to find my father dead, the farm in ruins, and my mother trying to hold on with my younger siblings. I stayed until she remarried, then drifted west. Worked as a ranch hand, a miner, whatever would pay, saved every penny until I had enough to file a homestead claim. He gestured around them. And here I am. Here you are, Katherine echoed softly, building something that's yours. Trying to, Ben corrected, a trace of bitterness creeping into his voice. 3 years of breaking my back, and I'm still one bad season away from losing it all. You won't lose it, Katherine said with surprising fierceness. We'll find a way. That we again, small but significant. Ben met her eyes across the firelit room, seeing determination there and something else he couldn't quite name. Why did you answer my advertisement, Katherine? He asked suddenly. Of all the places you could have gone after your husband died, why come to a struggling homestead in Wyoming? Katherine was quiet for so long that Ben thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I needed to go somewhere no one knew me or my failures. Somewhere I could simply be Katherine again, not the widow of the man who ruined himself with dreams too big for his means. She looked up, meeting Ben's gaze directly. And because your letter sounded lonely, Ben, as lonely as I was. The honesty of her answer caught him off guard. Ben had never considered himself lonely. He'd chosen this solitary life after all. But hearing Katherine name it so plainly made him recognize the truth of it. He had been desperately, achingly lonely before she arrived. And now, he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Are you still lonely, Katherine? A small smile touched her lips, genuine and warm. Less so every day. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Ben's back improved gradually with rest and Katherine's herbal treatments, but he found himself accepting help more readily than before. They worked together when possible, their conversations flowing more easily as the barriers between them slowly crumbled. Ben learned that Katherine had lost 2 pregnancies during her marriage, that she played the fiddle, though her instrument had been sold to pay debts, that she could recite long passages of Shakespeare from the single volume of collected works her schoolteacher mother had prized. Katherine discovered Ben's unexpected talent for whittling, his fondness for wild strawberries, the fact that he could read Latin thanks to a Union chaplain who'd taken an interest in the underage soldier. As October deepened toward November, they worked with increasing urgency to prepare for winter. The cattle were brought in closer to the barn, the final harvest was stored, and Ben completed the essential repairs to the roof and outbuildings. Katherine preserved what food she could and carefully inventoried their supplies, planning for the months when they would be isolated by snow. One evening, as the first serious cold snap hit the homestead, they sat close to the fire after dinner. Ben had taken to reading aloud from the few books they possessed, and Katherine would mend or knit as she listened. Tonight, a fierce wind howled outside, making the cabin creak and moan. Will it hold? Katherine asked, glancing up at the ceiling as a particularly strong gust rattled the windows. It's held for 3 winters so far, Ben replied confidently. I built it solid. Katherine smiled, returning to her knitting. You did it that. You've built something to be proud of here, Ben. He watched her hands move, creating something from nothing with patience and skill. We both have, he said quietly. Katherine looked up, their eyes meeting across the small space. Something had been building between them for weeks now, a tension, a possibility, an unspoken question. Ben felt it like a physical thing, this connection that had grown from employer and employee to friendship and now to something more. The wind gusted again and the fire sputtered, sending sparks up the chimney. One of the windows rattled so violently that Katherine startled, dropping a knitting needle. That doesn't sound right, Ben said, rising from his chair. He crossed to the window, peering out into the darkness. Can't see a thing, but that rattle isn't just the wind. He reached up, feeling along the frame until he found the problem. The seal's coming loose. We'll need to fix it before the real cold hits. Katherine set aside her knitting and joined him at the window. Will it hold for tonight? Ben nodded, but as he turned to reassure her, he realized how close she was standing. In the flickering firelight, her face was cast in gold and shadow, her eyes reflecting the flames. Without thinking, he reached up and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was innocent enough, but the moment his fingers brushed her skin, something changed in the air between them. Katherine's breath caught, and Ben found himself unable to pull his hand away, his palm coming to rest against her cheek. Katherine, he began, uncertainty making his voice rough. She leaned into his touch ever so slightly. Yes. Whatever Ben might have said next was lost as the wind gave a mighty howl and something heavy crashed against the side of the cabin. They both jumped, the moment broken, and Ben hurried to the door. Stay inside, he ordered, reaching for his coat and hat. Sounds like part of the woodpile might have collapsed. You're not going out in this alone, Katherine protested, already reaching for her own coat. What if you hurt your back again? Ben wanted to argue, but the determined set of her jaw told him it would be futile. Together, they ventured into the howling darkness, lanterns held high against the biting wind. The woodpile had indeed partially collapsed, with logs scattered dangerously close to the chicken coop. Working together, they quickly restacked the essentials and secured the rest as best they could, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. That should hold until morning, Ben shouted over the wind, securing a tarp over the pile with heavy stones. Katherine nodded, her face barely visible in the swinging lantern light. Ben took her elbow to steady her as they made their way back to the cabin, leaning into the wind that threatened to knock them off their feet. The warmth of the cabin enveloped them as they stumbled through the door, both gasping from the exertion and cold. Ben secured the door against the storm while Katherine hung their coats to dry by the fire. Your hands are like ice, she exclaimed, taking his between her own and rubbing them vigorously. Sit by the fire before you catch your death. Ben allowed himself to be led to the chair nearest the flames, too cold to protest the fussing. Katherine poured them each a small measure of whiskey from the bottle he kept for medicinal purposes, pressing the cup into his hands. Drink, she instructed. It will warm you from the inside. The whiskey burned pleasantly down his throat, and Ben felt the chill begin to recede from his bones. Katherine sat in the chair opposite, sipping her own drink with a slight grimace at the strength of it. I don't think I've ever seen a wind like this, she said, glancing toward the windows that continued to rattle in their frames. Is this normal for Wyoming? Ben shook his head. It gets bad, but this is fierce even by local standards. He studied her across the rim of his cup. Are you regretting your decision to come west? Katherine considered the question seriously, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. No, she said finally. Despite everything, the hardship, the isolation, the uncertainty, I don't regret it. Her gaze met his, steady and clear. Coming here gave me something I thought I'd lost for good. What's that? Ben asked, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. Hope, Katherine answered simply. The word hung between them, fragile and powerful. Ben set down his empty cup and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Katherine, he began, then hesitated, searching for the right words. These past months, having you here, it's changed things, changed me. He looked down at his calloused hands, then back up at her face. I know I hired you as a housekeeper, but you've become so much more than that. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I don't have much to offer, Ben went on, his voice gaining strength. Just this land and the hope that someday it might yield enough to live on comfortably. But if you wanted to stay, not as my housekeeper but as— He faltered, then forced himself to continue. As my partner, my wife, I would spend every day trying to make you happy. The proposal, unplanned and unpolished, hung in the air between them. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she set down her own cup, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. Ben, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you asking because you need someone to help with the homestead, or because— Because I'm falling in love with you, Ben interrupted, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. God help me, Katherine, I've been falling since the day you told me the chores could wait and made me rest. I've never met anyone like you, strong and kind and capable. You see me, truly see me, and you're still here. Katherine rose from her chair and crossed the small space between them, kneeling before him and taking his hands in hers. I see a good man, she said softly. A man who works until his body gives out because he's building something that matters. A man who treats me as an equal, not a possession or a servant. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. A man I could love for a lifetime if given the chance. Ben's heart thundered in his chest. Is that a yes? He asked, hardly daring to believe. Catherine's smile bloomed, transforming her face. Yes, Benjamin Tucker, I will stay and be your wife. With trembling hands, Ben cupped her face and leaned down to kiss her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first but deepening as Katherine responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing rapidly, and the howling wind outside seemed a distant thing. I should have done that weeks ago, Ben murmured, his forehead resting against hers. Katherine laughed softly. Perhaps, but some things are worth waiting for. That night, the storm continued to rage outside, but within the cabin, a different kind of storm had broken one of long-suppressed feelings finally acknowledged. They talked for hours, making plans and sharing hopes, occasionally falling into comfortable silences broken only by the crackling fire and the wind's fierce song. When exhaustion finally claimed them, Katherine retreated to her small room off the main cabin, but only after a lingering goodnight kiss that promised much more once they were properly married. The morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Ben woke early, as was his habit, to find Katherine already up and making breakfast, her face serene in the early light. Good morning, she said, smiling as he approached. Sleep well, Ben returned her smile, reaching out to brush his fingers against hers as she handed him a cup of coffee. Better than I have in years, he admitted. Though I kept waking, afraid I dreamed it all, Catherine's cheeks colored prettily. Not a dream, she assured him. Though we should discuss practical matters, when shall we marry, and how? Ben sipped his coffee, considering. The circuit preacher won't be through until spring, most likely. We could ride to Laramie, but that's 3 days' journey in good weather. And not advisable with winter coming, Katherine finished for him. Could we have a civil ceremony performed by a judge or justice of the peace? Cheyenne would be our best bet for that, Ben said. It's closer than Laramie, but still a journey. Katherine nodded thoughtfully. We should go soon, then, before the heavy snows make it impossible. She hesitated, then added, and there's the matter of propriety. If we're to share this cabin through winter. Ben understood her concern immediately. Though they were isolated, their reputations would still matter if they hoped to build a life in the territory. We'll leave for Cheyenne tomorrow, he decided. We can be there in 2 days if the weather holds, be married, and return before the week is out. Relief washed over Catherine's face. Thank you, Ben. I know it's an inconvenience with so much work to be done here, but nothing about marrying you could ever be an inconvenience, Ben interrupted firmly, rising to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. It's the most important thing I'll ever do. The journey to Cheyenne was arduous but uneventful. They drove the wagon along rutted trails, camping one night under clear, cold stars before reaching the territorial capital by mid-afternoon of the second day. Cheyenne in 1878 was a bustling railroad town, a far cry from their isolated homestead. They found rooms at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson, who clucked sympathetically when they explained their mission. "You'll want Judge Wilson," she advised, serving them a hot supper in her kitchen. "He's fair-minded and won't charge you an arm and a leg like some might. His office is just off the main square." The next morning, dressed in their best clothes, which for Ben meant his only suit, saved for funerals and rare trips to town, and for Katherine a blue dress she had carefully preserved from better days, they presented themselves at Judge Wilson's office. He was a portly man with kind eyes who agreed to perform the ceremony that very afternoon. "You'll need witnesses," he noted, shuffling through papers on his desk. "We don't know anyone in town except our landlady," Ben admitted. The judge waved a dismissive hand. "My clerk can serve as one." For the other, he glanced out his window at the busy street. "Mrs. Peterson is well respected. I'm sure she'd be happy to assist." And so it was arranged. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Katherine and Ben stood before Judge Wilson in his chambers with Mrs. Peterson beaming beside them and the clerk standing solemnly with the marriage license ready for signatures. The ceremony was brief but dignified. Judge Wilson spoke of the responsibilities of marriage, of the legal bonds they were forming, and finally asked them to recite simple vows to one another. Ben took Katherine's hands in his voice steady despite the emotion welling in his chest. "I, Benjamin Tucker, take you, Katherine Ellis, to be my lawful wedded wife. I promise to protect and provide for you, to respect and cherish you, to share with you all that I have and all that I am, from this day forward until death parts us." Katherine's eyes shimmered with tears as she repeated similar vows, her voice growing stronger with each word. When she finished, Judge Wilson nodded approvingly. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled kindly. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Tucker." Ben cupped Katherine's face gently and kissed her, a brief but tender seal on their vows. Mrs. Peterson sniffled happily in the background as they signed the marriage certificate, making their union official in the eyes of the law. "I've taken the liberty of reserving you a private dining room at the Railroad Hotel for your wedding supper," Mrs. Peterson announced as they left the judge's chambers. "Consider it my gift to you both." Dinner at the Railroad Hotel was the most elegant meal either Ben or Katherine had enjoyed in years. They feasted on roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and even a small wedding cake that Mrs. Peterson had somehow arranged. A bottle of champagne, their first ever, completed the celebratory meal. "To new beginnings," Ben toasted, raising his glass. "And to finding home in unexpected places," Katherine added, touching her glass to his. As they sipped the unfamiliar bubbly liquid, a comfortable silence fell between them. The reality of their new status was still sinking in, no longer employer and employee, but husband and wife. "I never thought I'd marry again," Katherine admitted softly. "After James died, I believed that chapter of my life was closed forever." Ben reached across the table to take her hand. "I never thought I'd marry at all," he confessed. "The war, it changed me, made me wary of connections, until you—" Katherine turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "What changed?" Ben considered the question seriously. "You showed me there was more to life than just surviving. More than working from sunup to sundown." He squeezed her hand. "You taught me that sometimes the chores can wait." A smile lit Katherine's face, transforming it in the soft lamplight. "You're learning," she teased gently, later that night in the privacy of the room Mrs. Peterson had prepared for them the best in her boarding house. With a real feather mattress and fresh linens, Ben and Katherine consummated their marriage with a tenderness that gradually gave way to passion. For both, it was a revelation, the discovery that physical love could be a true communion of bodies and souls, a tangible expression of the bond growing between them. Afterward, Katherine lay with her head on Ben's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart as his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I wish we could stay like this," she murmured drowsily. "Just for a little while." Ben pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We have tomorrow," he reminded her. "I thought we might buy supplies before heading back to the homestead. Is there anything you need from town?" Katherine propped herself up on one elbow, her hair falling in a curtain around her face. Actually, yes. Fabric for curtains and perhaps a new tablecloth, and seeds for the spring garden. Her eyes brightened with an idea. And perhaps some sheet music if the general store carries any. I've been thinking of teaching you to sing. Ben laughed, pulling her down for another kiss. I should warn you, my voice has been compared unfavorably to a wounded coyote. I'll be the judge of that, Katherine replied, settling back against him with a contented sigh. They spent the following day exploring Cheyenne, purchasing supplies and small luxuries for their home. Ben insisted on buying Katherine a silver hairbrush and mirror set she had admired in a shop window, while she surprised him with a fine leather-bound journal and pencils for the sketching she'd discovered he enjoyed but rarely indulged. By mid-afternoon, the wagon was loaded and ready for the journey home. They said their goodbyes to Mrs. Peterson, who pressed a small package into Katherine's hands. Wedding cookies, she explained with a wink, for the journey. The return trip to the homestead seemed shorter somehow, filled as it was with conversation and occasional stops to simply enjoy being together away from the pressures of daily work. They arrived home on the third day as the sun was setting over the distant mountains. Ben carried Katherine across the threshold of the cabin, both of them laughing at the formality of it in their rustic surroundings. But as he set her down in the main room, they both felt the significance of the moment. This was no longer Ben's cabin with Katherine as his housekeeper. It was their home, the beginning of their shared life together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Tucker," Ben said softly, drawing her into his arms. Katherine's face glowed with happiness as she reached up to touch his cheek. "It's good to be home, husband." The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and joy for the newlyweds. They settled into new patterns, sharing the main room of the cabin while making plans to expand it come spring, dividing chores based on skill rather than traditional roles, and learning the rhythm of life as partners rather than employer and employee. Katherine proved to be as capable outside as she was within the cabin, often working alongside Ben with the livestock and repairs. For his part, Ben discovered an unexpected talent for cooking when Katherine taught him some basic recipes, and he took pride in occasionally preparing their meals when she was busy with other tasks. As November deepened toward December, and the first heavy snows blanketed the homestead, they found a coziness in their isolation that neither had anticipated. Evenings were spent before the fire, reading aloud, playing checkers with a set Ben had carved, or simply talking about their hopes for the future. "I've been thinking," Ben said one such evening as they sat side by side on the small sofa he'd built after their wedding, Katherine's feet tucked under his thigh for warmth. "What if we diversified beyond cattle next year?" Katherine looked up from her mending. "What did you have in mind?" "Horses," Ben replied, warming to his subject. "Not many, just a few good breeding mares and a stallion to start. The army's always buying, and so are the big ranches to the north." Katherine considered this thoughtfully. It could work. "The southern pasture has better shelter and would be suitable for foaling." She set aside her sewing. "But horses are a bigger investment than cattle. Where would the money come from?" Ben reached for the strongbox he kept under the floorboards, unlocking it to reveal a small leather pouch. "I've been saving," he explained, pouring a handful of gold coins onto the table. "It's not much, but it might be enough for a start if we're careful." Katherine stared at the money in surprise. "You never mentioned this." "It was my emergency fund," Ben admitted. "In case the homestead failed and we had to leave." "And now?" Katherine asked softly. Ben gathered the coins back into the pouch. "Now I believe in our future here. I want to invest in it, not save for its failure." Katherine's eyes shone with emotion as she leaned over to kiss him. "Then we'll buy horses in the spring," she declared. "And I have some ideas about expanding the vegetable garden as well. Perhaps we could sell produce to the miners in the hills." Their planning session turned to more intimate matters as the evening progressed, and they retired early to the bed they now shared, demonstrating with actions what words could not adequately express their growing love, their commitment to building a life together. The winter proved to be as harsh as Ben had feared, with blizzards that sometimes kept them housebound for days at a time. Yet even in these forced confinements, they found contentment. Katherine used the time to sew new curtains and teach Ben to play the small harmonica they'd purchased in Cheyenne. Ben worked on furniture for their expanding home and read voraciously from the books they'd acquired. By February, however, their supplies were running dangerously low despite careful rationing. The nearest trading post was a full day's journey in good weather, and the snow lay thick across the territory. "We can make it last another week," Katherine insisted as they inventoried what remained: a small sack of flour, some dried beans, a little coffee, and the last of their salt pork. "The weather might improve by then." Ben shook his head grimly. "And it might worsen." "I should go tomorrow while there's a break in the storms." Katherine's face paled. "Not alone, it's too dangerous." "More dangerous for both of us to go and leave the homestead unattended," Ben argued gently. "I'll take the strongest horse and travel light. I'll be back before dark the next day." Katherine wanted to protest further, but she recognized the logic of his plan. Still, as she helped him prepare for the journey, her hands trembled slightly. "Promise me you'll turn back if the weather changes," she insisted, packing food for the trip. "The supplies can wait." Ben caught her hands, stilling their nervous movement. "I promise," he said solemnly. "Nothing is worth risking not coming back to you." He set out before dawn the next morning, mounted on their sturdiest gelding with empty saddlebags ready to be filled. Katherine stood on the porch until he disappeared from sight, then turned back to the empty cabin, determined to keep busy rather than worry. The day passed slowly as she tended to the animals, mended clothes, and prepared a thin soup from their remaining supplies. As dusk approached, the wind began to rise and dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Katherine watched anxiously from the window, knowing that Ben was likely reaching the trading post about now and would spend the night before heading back in the morning. Sleep eluded her that night as the wind grew to a howl and snow began to fall once more. By morning, several inches of fresh powder covered the ground, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Katherine paced the cabin, torn between fear for Ben and faith in his abilities. When a knock came at the door shortly after noon, Katherine's heart leapt with hope that quickly turned to confusion. Ben wouldn't knock at his own door. Cautiously, she approached, the rifle from above the fireplace in her hands. "Who's there?" she called. "Madam, it's Sheriff Daniels from the county seat," came the reply. "I've got news about your husband." Katherine's blood ran cold as she unbolted the door to reveal a snow-covered man in his 40s, a badge pinned to his heavy coat. Behind him stood another man holding the reins of 2 horses. "Mrs. Tucker?" the sheriff asked, removing his hat. "Yes," Katherine whispered, her knuckles white around the rifle. "What's happened to Ben?" "He's alive, madam," the sheriff assured her quickly. "But there's been an accident. His horse slipped on the ice crossing Miller's Creek." "Mr. Tucker took a bad fall, broke his leg and maybe some ribs. Doc Jenkins at the trading post has him stabilized, but he asked me to come fetch you." Relief warred with fresh worry in Katherine's chest. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that he can't travel for a while, but the doc says he'll mend with proper care." The sheriff nodded to the man behind him. "This here's Deputy Collins. We brought an extra horse for you if you're willing to make the journey. It's rough going in this weather, but we'll see you safe." Katherine didn't hesitate. "Give me 10 minutes to pack and secure things here." She moved with efficient haste, gathering medical supplies, warm clothes, and the emergency money from the strongbox. After ensuring the livestock had enough feed and water to last several days, she donned her warmest clothes and mounted the horse the deputy held ready. The journey to the trading post was arduous, the snow falling steadily as they picked their way carefully along trails that were barely visible. Katherine's face grew numb with cold despite the scarf wrapped around it, but she pressed on without complaint, focused entirely on reaching Ben. It was nearly nightfall when they finally arrived at the small collection of buildings that made up the trading post. The sheriff led her directly to a small room behind the main store, where Ben lay on a narrow bed, his face pale with pain. "Katherine," he breathed when she entered, relief washing over his features. "You shouldn't have come in this weather." "As if wild horses could have kept me away," she replied, dropping to her knees beside the bed and gently touching his face. "How bad is it?" Clean break of the left tibia, said an older man who entered behind her, wiping his hands on a towel. 2 cracked ribs, various contusions, and mild exposure. I'm Doc Jenkins. He extended his hand to Katherine. Your husband was lucky, Mrs. Tucker, if those trappers hadn't found him when they did. Katherine swallowed hard, not wanting to contemplate what might have happened. Will he recover fully? The doctor nodded. With proper rest and care, yes, but he won't be traveling anywhere for at least 6 weeks, and that leg will need careful tending. 6 weeks. The implications of this settled heavily on Katherine's shoulders. 6 weeks away from the homestead, in the dead of winter. We have a room above the store you can use, the doctor continued, sensing her concern. Mr. Holloway, the proprietor, says you're welcome to stay as long as needed. Thank you, Katherine said sincerely. And our payment already arranged, Ben interrupted weakly. I had the emergency money with me. It's enough to cover our stay and the supplies we'll need when we return home. Katherine turned back to him, her eyes filling with tears of relief and love. Always thinking ahead, aren't you? Ben managed a small smile despite his obvious pain. I promised I'd come back to you, didn't I? Just taking a bit longer than expected. Their stay at the trading post stretched from weeks into months as Ben's recovery progressed more slowly than hoped. The broken leg mended well enough, but the exposure had weakened his lungs, leading to a persistent cough that concerned Doc Jenkins. Katherine rarely left Ben's side, nursing him with tender determination. She read to him during long days of forced inactivity, played checkers with him when he felt strong enough, and listened as he fretted about the homestead they'd left untended. The cattle will have broken into the hay storage by now, he worried one evening in late March as they sat by the window of their rented room. And the roof, what if it's leaked with all the snow? Katherine took his hand, her touch calming. The animals know how to survive, Ben. And buildings can be repaired. She met his troubled gaze steadily. What matters is that you're healing, Ben sighed, squeezing her fingers gratefully. I don't deserve your patience. It's not about deserving, Katherine replied simply. It's about loving. By early April, the worst of winter had passed, and Ben was finally strong enough to travel. His leg had healed sufficiently to bear weight with the aid of a crutch, and his cough had diminished to an occasional reminder of his ordeal. Mr. Holloway, who had become a friend during their extended stay, offered to drive them home in his wagon. Least I can do, he insisted. Besides, I need to restock my inventory, and you mentioned having extra chickens to trade. The journey back to the homestead was filled with trepidation. Neither Ben nor Katherine knew what they would find after nearly 3 months away. As they crested the final hill and the small cabin came into view, both held their breath. The sight that greeted them was both better and worse than feared. The cabin stood intact, though one corner of the roof showed signs of damage. The barn door hung askew, and the cattle had indeed broken through the fencing around the hay storage. But most of the animals appeared to have survived, grazing in the spring green fields. Most surprising of all was the thin column of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. Someone's there, Ben said sharply, reaching instinctively for the rifle that wasn't at his side. Mr. Holloway slowed the wagon. Want me to go ahead and check? Before either man could decide, the cabin door opened, and a figure stepped onto the porch, a tall man with a gray beard who raised his hand in greeting. That's Ezra Johnson, Ben said in disbelief, recognizing their nearest neighbor, whose homestead lay 5 miles to the east. What's he doing here? As the wagon approached, Ezra came to meet them, his weathered face breaking into a smile. About time you folks came home, he called, beginning to think I'd be looking after this place forever. Katherine was the first to recover from her surprise. You've been caring for our homestead? Ezra nodded, helping Ben down from the wagon. Sheriff Daniels rode by in February, told me what happened, said you'd be laid up for a spell. He shrugged as if his actions were unremarkable. Neighbors help neighbors out here. I've been checking on your stock every few days, patched the roof best I could after that big storm in March. Ben extended his hand, deeply moved. I don't know how to thank you, Ezra. The older man clasped Ben's hand firmly. No need, you'd have done the same. He gestured toward the cabin. Got a stew on the fire and fresh coffee brewing. Figured you'd be hungry after the journey. That evening, as they sat around the table with Ezra and Mr. Holloway, Ben and Katherine learned how the community had rallied in their absence. Not just Ezra, but several other homesteaders from miles around had taken turns checking on their property, ensuring the livestock were fed and the worst damage repaired. Mrs. Patterson from over by the creek brought those preserves, Ezra explained, pointing to several jars on the shelf. And the Wilsons left that smoked venison hanging in the shed. Katherine's eyes filled with tears. We barely know these people. Doesn't matter, Ezra said simply. Out here we look after our own. After Ezra and Mr. Holloway departed, the latter promising to return the following week with mail and any supplies they might need, Ben and Katherine stood together on the porch of their cabin, surveying their homestead in the fading light. It's going to take months to get everything back in proper order, Ben said, leaning on his crutch as he assessed the work ahead. Katherine slipped her arm around his waist, supporting him both physically and emotionally. Then it will take months, she replied calmly. We'll do what we can each day and the rest will wait. Ben looked down at her, love swelling in his chest. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher, Katherine said with a smile, leading him back inside their home. The spring and summer of 1879 passed in a blur of activity as Ben and Katherine worked to restore their homestead. Ben's recovery continued steadily, though he would always walk with a slight limp in cold weather. Katherine took on more of the physical labor during his convalescence, proving herself as capable with an axe or plow as with a needle and thread. Their plans to diversify into horse breeding had to be postponed, the money that would have purchased breeding stock having been spent on medical care and their extended stay at the trading post. But neither Ben nor Katherine regretted this. The investment had been in Ben's recovery, in their future together. By late summer, most of the repairs had been completed. The barn stood solid once more, the fences had been mended, and a new section had been added to the cabin, a proper bedroom that gave them more privacy and comfort than they had known before. On the anniversary of the day Katherine had first told Ben to rest, that the chores would wait, they sat together on the porch they had built that summer, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. I have something to tell you, Katherine said, her voice soft with emotion as she took Ben's hand and placed it gently against her stomach. The doctor confirmed it when we were in town last week. Ben's eyes widened as understanding dawned. A baby. Katherine nodded, happy tears spilling down her cheeks. Due in February, joy unlike anything Ben had ever known surged through him. He gathered Katherine into his arms, mindful of her condition even in his excitement. A child, he whispered against her hair. Our child. Are you happy? Katherine asked, drawing back to search his face. Happy doesn't begin to describe it, Ben replied, kissing her tenderly. Terrified, overwhelmed, grateful, all of those too, Katherine laughed, the sound pure and joyful in the evening air. I feel the same. There's so much to prepare, so much to do before winter comes. Ben gazed at the woman who had transformed his life in less than 2 years from housekeeper to wife to the mother of his child. The woman who had taught him that work wasn't everything, that sometimes rest was as important as labor, that building a life meant more than just building a homestead. The chores will wait, he said softly, echoing her words from a year ago. Tonight, let's just be happy. Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I am happy, Ben, happier than I ever thought possible. The preparations for winter and the baby's arrival filled their days as autumn painted the landscape in russets and golds. Ben worked with renewed purpose, building a cradle from seasoned wood, enlarging the root cellar to store more preserves, ensuring every chink in the cabin walls was sealed against the coming cold. Katherine sewed baby clothes from fabric they purchased in town, put up preserves from their expanded garden, and continued to help with the daily chores despite Ben's concerns about her overexerting herself. I'm with child, not made of glass, she reminded him when he tried to take a basket of laundry from her hands. Women have been working while carrying babies since the beginning of time. Ben reluctantly conceded this point, but still found ways to lighten her load, often completing household tasks before she could get to them. Katherine pretended not to notice this strategy, secretly touched by his concern. As November brought the first snows, they were better prepared than they had ever been. The barn was full of hay, the root cellar stocked with preserves and root vegetables, and a good supply of firewood stacked neatly against the cabin wall. The cattle were healthy, the chickens producing well, and they had even managed to set aside a small sum toward their postponed dream of horse breeding. One evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Ben sorting through seeds for the spring planting while Katherine knitted a small blanket, a knock came at the door, an unusual occurrence given their remote location and the early winter weather. Ben rose, hand instinctively moving toward the rifle before he caught himself. Most likely it was Ezra Johnson or another neighbor seeking shelter from the snow. When he opened the door, however, he found himself facing a stranger, a thin man in a city suit, looking decidedly out of place against the snowy backdrop. "Mr. Benjamin Tucker?" the man inquired, consulting a paper in his gloved hand. "That's me," Ben confirmed warily. "What can I do for you?" The man offered a thin smile. "My name is Percival Whitman, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He glanced past Ben to the warmth of the cabin. "Might I come in? It's rather cold out here." Ben hesitated, then stepped aside to allow the man entry. Katherine had set aside her knitting and risen to her feet, one hand resting protectively on her swollen abdomen. "This is my wife, Katherine," Ben said, closing the door against the cold. "Mr. Whitman represents the railroad." Whitman removed his hat, nodding politely to Katherine. "Forgive the intrusion, Mrs. Tucker. I've been visiting homesteads in the region on company business." "What sort of business brings you out in this weather?" Katherine asked, her tone cordial but cautious. Whitman took a seat when Ben gestured to a chair, rubbing his hands to warm them. "The Western Pacific is planning a new spur line to connect the mining operations in the hills with the main track. We're surveying possible routes and securing rights of way." He extracted a map from his leather case, spreading it on the table. "One of the proposed routes would cross the corner of your property, Mr. Tucker." Ben and Katherine exchanged glances. "What exactly are you proposing?" Ben asked. "The railroad would purchase a strip of land 60 feet wide along your southern boundary," Whitman explained, tracing the route on the map. "We're prepared to offer $5 per acre for the affected portion, approximately 20 acres in total. That's $100, a very generous sum." Ben studied the map carefully. The proposed route would cut across their southernmost pasture, the very area he had considered ideal for horse breeding. "And if we're not interested in selling?" Katherine asked, voicing the question Ben was considering. Whitman's smile tightened slightly. "The railroad has ways of acquiring necessary land, Mrs. Tucker, eminent domain, for instance, but we prefer to deal fairly with landowners when possible." He reached into his case again, withdrawing an envelope. "Consider this a good faith payment, $25 now, with the balance payable upon signing the necessary documents." Ben made no move to take the envelope. "We'll need time to consider your offer, Mr. Whitman." The railroad man's expression flickered with annoyance before smoothing into a professional mask. "Of course, I'll be staying in town until the end of the week." He rose, returning the map to his case. "But I should warn you, Mr. Tucker, this offer is time-sensitive. Other routes are being considered, and once the decision is made, the opportunity will be lost." "We understand," Ben said, rising to show the man out. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." After Whitman had departed, disappearing into the snowy darkness toward the town 10 miles distant, Ben and Katherine sat in thoughtful silence. $100 is a significant sum," Katherine finally said. "Enough for those breeding horses we've talked about, with money left over." Ben nodded slowly. "It is. But that southern pasture is the best land we have protected from the worst winds, with good access to water. Could we work around the railroad if it goes through?" Katherine wondered, her practical mind already seeking solutions, perhaps with proper fencing. "Perhaps," Ben agreed, but his voice was doubtful. But there's the noise to consider, the smoke, the danger to livestock, and who knows what rights they'd claim beyond the actual track. Katherine reached across the table to take his hand. What does your instinct tell you? Ben met her eyes, grateful as always for her steady presence. That Whitman isn't telling us everything, that once the railroad has a foothold on our land, they'll want more. Then we'll refuse, Katherine said simply. This homestead is our future, our child's future. We won't compromise it for quick money. Ben squeezed her hand, his decision made. I'll ride to town tomorrow and give Whitman our answer. The meeting with Whitman the following day went as expected: initial disbelief, followed by thinly veiled threats about eminent domain and the progress of civilization. Ben stood firm, however, and returned home satisfied that he had made the right choice for his family. What he didn't anticipate was Whitman's persistence. Over the next few weeks, the railroad man appeared at their door twice more, each time with a slightly higher offer and increasingly pointed remarks about the railroad's influence with territorial officials. He's becoming a nuisance, Katherine remarked after Whitman's third visit, during which he had hinted that the railroad might contest the validity of their homestead claim. Perhaps we should speak with Sheriff Daniels about this harassment. Ben agreed, but before they could act on this suggestion, nature intervened in the form of a blizzard that isolated them for nearly 2 weeks. By the time the weather cleared enough for travel, Whitman had apparently departed the territory, his threats unfulfilled. The railroad likely found an easier route, Ezra Johnson suggested when he visited in late December, bringing Christmas gifts of smoked ham and a hand-carved toy horse for the coming baby. They prefer not to fight if they can help it. Too much bad publicity. Ben wasn't entirely convinced, but as January passed without further railroad interference, he began to relax. Katherine's pregnancy was progressing well, the baby active and strong according to Doc Jenkins, who had made the journey to check on her despite the winter conditions. Everything looks perfect, the doctor assured them after examining Katherine. Just make sure she rests more as the time approaches. First babies often come late, but better to be prepared. Ben took this advice to heart, insisting that Katherine allow him to take on more of the household duties in addition to his outside work. To his surprise, she agreed with minimal protest, a sign of how tired she truly was as she entered her final month of pregnancy. February arrived with bitter cold but mercifully little new snow. Ben kept the paths to the barn and well cleared, ensuring Katherine wouldn't have to struggle through drifts if she needed to move about while he was tending to the livestock. On the morning of February 12th, Ben woke before dawn as usual, careful not to disturb Katherine as he slipped from their bed. She had been restless during the night, and he wanted her to get as much sleep as possible before the day began. He had just finished milking the cow when he heard Katherine calling his name from the cabin porch, her voice tight with urgency. Abandoning the milk pail, he ran through the snow, heart hammering in his chest. Katherine stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, the other cradling her belly. "It's time," she said simply, her face pale but composed. Ben helped her back inside into their bed, his mind racing. "I should get Doc Jenkins," he said, already reaching for his coat. Katherine caught his hand. "There's no time, Ben. The pains are coming fast, too fast for you to reach town and bring the doctor back." Fear clutched at Ben's throat. "But I don't know what to do," he admitted, feeling helpless for the first time in years. Katherine's expression softened despite her pain. "I do. My mother was a midwife, remember? I helped her many times." She guided his hand to her belly, where he could feel the powerful contraction rippling beneath her skin. "I need you to be calm and do exactly as I say." And so began the most terrifying and miraculous day of Benjamin Tucker's life. For hours, he followed Katherine's instructions, boiling water, preparing clean linens, supporting her through increasingly powerful contractions. Despite her own pain and exhaustion, she directed him with remarkable clarity, drawing on knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. As the winter sun reached its zenith, Katherine's labor intensified. Ben held her hands, wiped her brow, and murmured encouragement as she worked to bring their child into the world. "I can see the head," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "You're doing it, Katherine, just a little more." With a final, tremendous effort, Katherine pushed their child into Ben's waiting hands, a perfect, squalling baby girl with a thatch of dark hair and her mother's determined chin. "We have a daughter," Ben whispered in awe, carefully placing the infant on Katherine's chest as she had instructed. "She's beautiful, just like her mother." Tears of joy streamed down Katherine's face as she cradled their daughter. "Hello, little one," she murmured. "We've been waiting for you." Ben completed the tasks. Katherine directed cutting and tying the cord, delivering the afterbirth, cleaning and swaddling their daughter before settling beside his exhausted wife on the bed, his heart so full it felt it might burst. "What shall we name her?" he asked, gently stroking the baby's cheek with one finger. Katherine smiled up at him, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "I thought perhaps Elizabeth, after my mother." "Elizabeth Tucker," Ben said, testing the name. "It's perfect." As dusk fell, with Katherine and Elizabeth sleeping peacefully, Ben stepped onto the porch of their cabin. The winter landscape stretched before him, bathed in the pink and gold light of sunset. 3 years ago, he had seen only empty land here, a place to work and perhaps prosper. Now he saw home, family, future. He thought of all the events that had led to this moment: his desperate advertisement for a housekeeper, Katherine's arrival, his injured back that first taught him the value of rest, their growing love, his accident and recovery, and now the birth of their daughter. Through it all, Katherine had been his anchor, teaching him that a life worth building was about more than endless labor. Ben turned back toward the cabin, toward the woman who had changed everything and the child who represented their shared future. As he reached for the door, he whispered a promise to both of them and to himself. The chores will wait. Spring 1879 brought new life to the Tucker homestead. As the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared, Elizabeth, or Libby as they had begun to call her, grew and thrived. Katherine recovered her strength quickly, often carrying the baby in a sling as she tended to her daily tasks. Ben marveled at her resilience, at how effortlessly she seemed to balance motherhood with the demands of frontier life. "It's not effortless," Katherine admitted one evening when he expressed this thought, "but it is joyful, which makes the work seem lighter." With the improving weather came the opportunity to finally begin their horse breeding venture. The railroad's threats had not materialized, and the southern pasture remained untouched, ready for the purpose they had long planned. "Ezra mentioned that the Wilson place is selling off some stock," Ben told Katherine as they sat on the porch one mild evening in late April, Libby sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "They have 2 Morgan mares that might be perfect for us to start with." Katherine nodded thoughtfully. "Morgans are good all-around horses, strong enough for work but gentle enough for riding. What about a stallion?" "There's a quarter-horse stud at the Rocking H Ranch that's proven himself," Ben replied. "A bit more expensive than I'd planned, but the bloodlines would be worth it." "Then we should do it," Katherine said decisively. "We've waited long enough for this dream." The following week, Ben rode to the Wilson homestead and returned leading 2 beautiful bay mares, their coats gleaming in the spring sunlight. Katherine stood on the porch, Libby in her arms, as Ben proudly presented their new acquisitions. "They're perfect," she declared, coming down to stroke the velvet noses of the curious horses. "What are their names?" "This one's Penny," Ben said, patting the slightly larger mare. "And this is Sadie. They're both 5 years old and have already produced healthy foals." Libby reached out a tiny hand, fascinated by the huge creatures before her. Ben carefully guided her small fingers to touch Sadie's soft muzzle, laughing as the baby's eyes widened in delight. "She'll be riding before we know it," Katherine predicted, smiling at the sight of father and daughter bonding over the horses. The quarter-horse stallion, a magnificent chestnut named Thunder, joined their small herd 2 weeks later. With his powerful build and gentle disposition, he was exactly what Ben had hoped for: a foundation sire for what would become the Tucker horse breeding program. As spring turned to summer, the homestead flourished. The vegetable garden Katherine had expanded yielded abundantly, providing not only for their own table but producing enough surplus to sell in town. The cattle herd had grown, with healthy calves replacing the few animals lost during the previous winter. And most exciting of all, both Penny and Sadie were confirmed in foal to thunder, with births expected the following spring. One warm July afternoon, as Ben and Katherine worked together setting fence posts for a new corral, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Daniels rode toward them, accompanied by a young deputy and a well-dressed stranger. "Afternoon, Tuckers," the sheriff called as they approached. "Hope we're not disturbing your work." Ben set down his post-hole digger, wiping sweat from his brow. "Always time for visitors, Sheriff." "What brings you out our way?" Sheriff Daniels dismounted, nodding toward the stranger. "This is Mr. Hammond from the Territorial Land Office. He's asked me to accompany him on some official business." A knot of apprehension formed in Ben's stomach as he shook Hammond's hand. The man's expression was neutral, but there was a certain officiousness in his manner that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Perhaps we could speak inside, Mr. Tucker," Hammond suggested, glancing at the hot sun overhead. Katherine, who had been observing the exchange with growing concern, nodded. "I'll fetch some cool water. Please come in." Once they were seated around the kitchen table, Hammond withdrew several documents from his leather case. "Mr. Tucker, it has come to the attention of the Territorial Land Office that there may be irregularities in your homestead claim." Ben's jaw tightened. "What kind of irregularities? I filed all the proper paperwork and have fulfilled every requirement for proving up the claim." Hammond adjusted his spectacles. "According to our records, you claimed this land under the Homestead Act in 1875, correct?" "That's right," Ben confirmed. "I've lived here continuously since then, made all the required improvements, and cultivated the specified acreage." Hammond nodded, consulting another document. "However, we have information suggesting that you were absent from the property for an extended period this past winter, nearly 3 months, in fact. As you know, continuous residence is a key requirement of the Homestead Act." Ben exchanged a quick glance with Katherine, understanding dawning. "I was injured in an accident and unable to travel," he explained. "My wife and I stayed at the trading post while I recovered, but we never abandoned our claim." "Nevertheless," Hammond continued smoothly, "the law is quite specific. Absences of more than 2 weeks must be approved in advance by the land office with proper justification provided." "This is absurd," Katherine interrupted, her voice tight with anger. "My husband nearly died." "Are you suggesting we should have risked his life further by bringing him back before he could safely travel?" The sheriff, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. "Hammond, I can vouch for the circumstances. I personally informed neighbors about the Tuckers' situation, and several of them looked after the property during their absence." Hammond remained unmoved. "While that's commendable, Sheriff, it doesn't change the legal requirements. Furthermore," he added, withdrawing yet another document, "we have received a formal challenge to the claim from the Western Pacific Railroad Company, who assert prior interest in a portion of this land for right-of-way purposes." And there it was, the real reason for this visit. Ben's suspicions about Whitman had been justified after all. The railroad, unable to buy what they wanted, had found another way to press their claim. "This is outrageous," Ben said, struggling to keep his voice level. "We refused to sell to the railroad, so now they're trying to invalidate our entire homestead. On a technicality." Hammond closed his portfolio. "I'm simply doing my job, Mr. Tucker. You'll receive formal notification of the challenge and will have 30 days to respond. There will be a hearing before the Territorial Commissioner where you can present your case." He rose, gathering his hat. "Good day to you both." After Hammond and his escort had departed, Ben and Katherine sat in stunned silence, the implications of the visit sinking in. "They can't just take our land," Katherine finally said, her voice fierce with determination. "We've worked too hard, sacrificed too much." Ben reached across the table for her hand. "No, they can't and they won't." He squeezed her fingers reassuringly. "We'll fight this, Katherine. Whatever it takes." The following week was a flurry of activity as Ben and Katherine prepared their defense. They rode to neighboring homesteads, collecting written statements from Ezra Johnson and others who had watched over their property. They visited Doc Jenkins at the trading post, who provided a detailed account of Ben's injuries and treatment. They even made the journey to the county seat to consult with a lawyer, though his fees were steep and his advice not particularly encouraging. The railroad has considerable influence with territorial officials, the lawyer warned them. And technically, Hammond is correct about the residence requirement. Your best hope is to appeal to the commissioner's sense of fairness and demonstrate your good faith in developing the homestead. As the day of the hearing approached, Ben found himself increasingly anxious. Everything they had built together was at stake: their home, their livelihood, their future. One night, unable to sleep, he slipped from bed and walked outside, seeking solace in the star-filled sky. He found Katherine already on the porch, Libby sleeping against her shoulder as she gazed out at the moonlit landscape. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked softly, joining her on the bench they had built together. Katherine shook her head. "I keep thinking about what we'll do if we lose this place." The question had been haunting Ben as well. "We'll start over somewhere else if we have to," he said, though the thought of leaving the land they had poured so much of themselves into was almost unbearable. Katherine leaned against him, Libby warm and solid between them. "I believe in us, Ben. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a relatively imposing structure for the frontier. Ben wore his best suit, the same one he had worn for their wedding, while Katherine had spent hours ensuring her dress was perfectly pressed. Libby dressed in a tiny gown she had sewn especially for the occasion. The territorial commissioner, a stern-faced man named Hollister, presided from behind a massive oak desk. Representatives from the railroad, including the now familiar Percival Whitman, occupied one side of the room while Ben and Katherine sat at the other, Libby sleeping peacefully in a basket at Katherine's feet. Hammond presented the land office's case first, outlining the alleged violations of the homestead requirements and the railroad's prior claim to the right-of-way. Whitman followed, speaking eloquently about the railroad's importance to territorial development and the unfortunate necessity of challenging the Tuckers' claim. When Ben's turn came, he spoke simply but passionately about their 3 years on the homestead, the improvements they had made, the community they had joined, the life they had built. He explained the circumstances of his injury and absence, presenting the letters from neighbors and Doc Jenkins' medical testimony. "This land is more than just property to us," he concluded, his voice steady despite his nerves. "It's our home, our future, our daughter's birthright. We've acted in good faith throughout, and we ask that you recognize that in your decision." Commissioner Hollister asked several pointed questions about their residence and improvements, making notes on a pad before him. His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. Just as the hearing seemed to be concluding, the courtroom door opened, and Sheriff Daniels entered, followed by several men Ben recognized from neighboring homesteads, Ezra Johnson among them. "Commissioner," the sheriff said, approaching the desk, "these men have asked to speak on behalf of the Tuckers. They've come considerable distances to be here today." Hollister frowned at the interruption but nodded his permission. "Briefly, gentlemen." "This hearing has already run longer than scheduled." Ezra stepped forward, hat in hand. "I'm Ezra Johnson, Commissioner. My homestead borders the Tuckers to the east. I personally watched over their property during Ben's recovery, as did several others here." He gestured to the men behind him. "We're here to tell you that the Tuckers are good neighbors and honest folk. They've worked that land harder than anyone I know, and they deserve to keep it." One by one, the other homesteaders spoke simple, straightforward testimonials to Ben and Katherine's character and the legitimacy of their claim. Ben was deeply moved by this show of support, particularly from men who had their own demanding homesteads to tend. When the last man had spoken, Commissioner Hollister thanked them and announced that he would consider all testimony before rendering his decision. "Given the complexity of this case, I will need time to review the evidence thoroughly. You will receive my ruling by post within 2 weeks." As they left the courthouse, Ben and Katherine were surrounded by their neighbors, all offering encouragement and support. "Don't you worry," Ezra assured them, clapping Ben on the shoulder. Hollister's tough but fair, he'll see through the railroad schemes. Katherine, holding Libby close, expressed their gratitude to each man. We can never repay your kindness, she said, tears threatening despite her efforts to remain composed. No need for repayment, one of the older homesteaders replied gruffly. That's how we survive out here, by standing together. The 2 weeks of waiting were among the most difficult Ben and Katherine had experienced. They continued their daily work tending livestock, preparing for harvest, caring for Libby, but always with the shadow of uncertainty hanging over them. When the letter finally arrived, brought by a neighbor's son who had been to town, Katherine's hand trembled as she accepted it. Ben was in the barn and she called for him, unwilling to open it alone. They sat together at the kitchen table, the sealed envelope between them, Libby cooing in her cradle nearby. Whatever it says, Katherine said softly, we face it together. Ben nodded, breaking the seal and unfolding the official document inside. His expression remained unreadable as he scanned the formal language, and Katherine held her breath, watching his face for any hint of their fate. Finally, he looked up, a slow smile spreading across his features. We won. The commissioner has dismissed the challenge and affirmed our homestead claim as valid and in good standing. Katherine's hand flew to her mouth, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks. We get to keep our home. We get to keep our home, Ben confirmed, reading further. Hollister specifically cited the extraordinary circumstances of my injury and the community support and testimony as factors in his decision. He also warned the railroad against further harassment of legitimate homesteaders. With a cry of joy, Katherine threw her arms around Ben's neck. He held her tightly, his own eyes damp with emotion. They had fought for their land, their home, their future, and they had one word of their victory spread quickly through the scattered community of homesteaders. That weekend, neighbors arrived throughout the day, bringing food and drink for an impromptu celebration. Tables were set up in the yard, music played, including Katherine on a fiddle borrowed from a neighbor, and children ran laughing through the summer twilight. As dusk fell, Ben found himself sitting on the porch steps with Ezra Johnson, watching the festivities with contentment. You've built something good here, Ezra observed, nodding toward the gathering where Katherine was showing baby Libby to a circle of admiring women. Not just a homestead, but a life. Couldn't have done it without her, Ben replied honestly. She taught me that working yourself to death isn't the way to succeed, that sometimes the most important things are the moments you take to rest, to appreciate what you have. Ezra smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. Wise woman, your Katherine, reminds me of my Sarah, God rest her soul. He took a sip of his drink, gazing thoughtfully at the horizon. You know, I've been thinking of selling my place, moving on, getting too old for this life alone. Ben turned to him in surprise. Leaving, but you've been here longer than any of us. 10 years, Ezra confirmed. Built it from nothing, just like you, but with Sarah gone and the children all grown and moved away. He shrugged. It's just land in the end, the people are what matter. An idea began to form in Ben's mind. What if you didn't have to leave the area? What if there was another option? Over the next few days, Ben and Katherine discussed the possibility at length. Ezra's homestead was fully proved up and owned outright 160 acres of good land with a solid cabin, barn, and outbuildings. It adjoined their property to the east, potentially doubling their holdings if they could acquire it. But how can we afford to buy him out? Katherine wondered as they talked late into the night. We've put everything we have into our own place and the horses. Ben had been considering this problem. What if we offered a partnership instead of a purchase? Ezra could keep his house and a portion of the land for himself, but we'd work the rest together, sharing the profits. As he gets older, we'd take on more of the work and eventually, the whole property would come to us. Katherine's eyes brightened at the idea. A family arrangement rather than a business transaction. I think Ezra might prefer that he wouldn't feel like he was being pushed out, just supported in his later years. To their delight, Ezra embraced the proposal enthusiastically. Been looking for a solution that would let me stay in my home without the burden of working the whole place, he admitted when they presented the idea. This way, I get to keep my independence but have the security of family nearby. By the harvest of 1879, the arrangement was formalized. The Tucker homestead now effectively encompassed over 300 acres, with Ezra retaining his cabin and 20 surrounding acres for his personal use. The expanded operation allowed them to increase their cattle herd and provide better facilities for their growing horse breeding venture. That winter was one of contentment rather than struggle. With Ezra often joining them for meals and Libby growing more delightful by the day, their cabin was filled with laughter and conversation. Ben continued to work hard, but he had learned the value of balance, of taking time to rock his daughter to sleep or sit with Katherine by the fire in the evening. As spring 1880 approached, Ben found himself increasingly drawn to the southern pasture where Penny and Sadie, heavy with foal, grazed peacefully. The railroad's attempt to claim this particular piece of land had made it even more precious to him, a symbol of their successful defense of everything they had built together. One mild February afternoon, as Ben mended a section of fence, he spotted Katherine approaching across the field, Libby bundled against the lingering chill in a sling across her chest. "I thought you might like some company," she called as she drew near, "and someone was asking for her father." Ben set down his tools, smiling as Katherine unwrapped the layers to reveal their daughter's bright face. At 1 year old, Libby was a perfect blend of them, both Ben's dark hair and strong brow, Katherine's expressive eyes and determined chin. "There's my girl," Ben said, taking the baby into his arms. Libby immediately grabbed for his beard, a favorite game that never failed to delight her. Katherine laughed at their daughter's antics. "She certainly knows what she wants." "Just like her mother," Ben teased, wrapping his free arm around Katherine's waist and drawing her close. They stood together, surveying the land that stretched before them, the pastures where cattle grazed, the newly expanded barn where their horses would soon foal, the distant fields waiting for spring planting. All of it hard-won, all of it theirs. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Katherine asked softly. "If you hadn't injured your back that day, if I hadn't told you to rest?" Ben considered this, bouncing Libby gently as she began to fuss. "I think we would have found our way to each other regardless," he said finally, "but I'm grateful it happened as it did. That moment changed everything for me, made me see what truly mattered." Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as the setting sun bathed their land in golden light. "The Chores will always be there," she murmured, echoing the words that had begun their journey together. "But this moment won't come again." "No," Ben agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "So we'd better make the most of it." And there, in the pasture that they had fought to keep, with their daughter warm between them and the future stretched bright before them, Benjamin and Katherine Tucker did exactly that, savoring the present while building toward tomorrow, one precious moment at a time.